Okay, so we're gonna pick up where we left off on Wednesday. So we talked about how identities are dynamic, how identities are influenced by society, how we have multiple identities, how they're created in spurts through specific instances, and how they're created through communication, where we talked a little bit about like feral children and how they don't really have a sense of self because they haven't really communicated with humans. So they don't have a human identity. Sorry. So we're going to finish off with some of these traits about identities, talking about how they're developed in different ways in different cultures. So they don't develop the same way in every single culture, because obviously different cultures put value and emphasis on different things, different behaviors, different belief systems. So that's going to affect how we, form our identities. So in the United States, Americans, we very much value individuality, individualism, and we're very much encouraged to form a very strong sense of self. That 18, we turn 18, we go off to college, we move out of the house. At least that's kind of the American ideal, right? So our identity kind of ties in with being independent and more self-reliant, especially once we hit, 18. But in other societies and other cultures, so African, Asian, Latino societies, they emphasize more of that interdependency. So it emphasizes more of family. So how do you depend on other people? What are the ties that bind you, rather than, okay, well, I've had my 18th birthday, I'm leaving. In some of these more collectivist cultures, you might live more at home, but it very much focuses your identity on who your family is, rather than just who you are. So the difference between those two cultures and how they shape your identity is, how many of us, when we introduce ourselves, most of the time we might just say our first name, right? I'm Kylie. If you see me outside of school or whatever, that's what most of you guys call me. Heck, most of you guys call me that in class anyways. But in other cultures, so if you think about like Chinese and Japanese, they introduce themselves last name first. So that emphasis on the family bond. Their identity is more focused on which group or kin or tribe that they belong to. So that is wrapping up with our traits of identity. And now we're moving on to some more specific social and cultural identities. We identify with many different groups based on our gender, our age, our ethnicity, our occupational interest, our hobbies, the sports that we play, leisure activities, things we do for fun, or any special ability or disability. And this helps obviously shape who we are and how we communicate with other people. Because even if you think about like gender identity, do you communicate with men and women, non-binary people in the same way that you communicate with everybody else? I can tell you that personally, I communicate with my female friends a little bit differently than I communicate with my male friends. Mainly because of their gender and how it affects our communication. So for gender identity, so the formation of our gender identity, or how we see ourselves as male or female or somewhere in between on that spectrum, it begins when we're little. So it begins in infancy as people treat us certain ways based on their perception of how we should behave. So part of this might be like, oh, well, we're going to buy little girls doll houses or cooking stuff and have little boys play with fire trucks and footballs. People might not mean anything negative or bad about it, because that's just what most of us have been conditioned to do, and therefore we condition our children or our nieces and nephews, kids we're around, in a very similar way. But it's not the same as biological sex. So biological sex is the biological organs that you are born with, your chromosomes. But gender identity is communicated through our behaviors and how we dress. Just because a woman wears pants does not mean that she is a man, or just because a man wears nail polish does not mean that he is a woman. So our cultural norms very much influence how we feel about these different behaviors. So in some cultures it definitely might be really, really unnatural or not normal for a woman to wear pants. Or it might be very, very unusual for a man to wear nail polish or a man to wear a skirt. And then other cultures like the US, it's totally fine if a woman wants to wear pants. She's not going to be arrested for wearing pants. A guy's not going to be arrested for wearing a skirt. No one's going to be arrested for wearing whatever they want unless they happen to be naked and not wearing anything. In some cultures it's very normal for two men to kiss each other on the cheek when they greet. In America, that's not very much a cultural norm. But our pop culture, our popular culture, so just what people do, tends to affect how we socialize with other people that, may break some of those norms. But gender means different things in different cultures, and people present themselves differently in different cultures, just based on, people present themselves how they want and how they want to be perceived. But we negotiate how we want to be presented to other people, based on how we dress and how we keep our hair, how we talk, how we interact just with other people. And that helps give them some idea of how we want to be perceived. And then hopefully they treat us, in that way. Our sexual identities, they're not the same as gender identities, but they're really difficult to categorize and understand, because they very much shift over time and in different cultures, and everyone kind of has their own individual one. And then of course, who we are sexually attracted to and the language that we use to self-identify even complicate that more. But the biggest thing is just, it's very complex. So don't assume that your framework for different categories is universal. It's not universal across time, and it's not universal across cultures. Because if you think back to like ancient Greece, homosexuality was pretty normal. It was accepted. It was a very normal thing in society. Flash forward to 60 years ago, 100 years ago, we're still in a Western civilization, but 100 years ago, it was not really accepted at all. And there are still places in the world where you can be killed for that. But overall, it's just very complex. Don't assume that it's handled the same way all across the world. Because like I said, there are some places you can still be killed or imprisoned for who you are sexually attracted to or how you identify with who you are attracted to. Our age identity. So our age identity is influenced by cultural norms, cultural expectations of how people of a particular age should look and should act. So most of us here are probably in our 20s, so there's those cultural notions of how people in their 20s should act. If you look at how media portrays that, everyone in their 20s, you guys should all be partying every weekend and, getting drunk, and I don't, what do people in their 20s even do? I don't know. But, people in their 50s should all be mature and stately and have good jobs, and people in their 70s and 80s, they should all be grandparents and kindly and telling kids to get off their lawn. Obviously, not everyone in those age groups acts like that, but those are the cultural notions, the cultural norms of how people of those age are expected to act. But as people age, our perceptions of age change. Because when you were in elementary school and when you were young, you probably thought 30 was ancient. You know, now as you might be in your 20s or close to 30, you might be thinking that, oh my gosh, like 30 is not old. You might be like, oh my gosh, I'm 30 and I'm not old. So, you know, you might be 50 and being like, man, I thought 50 was going to feel old, but I still feel, you know, young. I still feel energetic. So as we age, our thoughts about age change. But if we try to communicate across that age gap, it can definitely cause misunderstandings. And it can definitely be difficult because even if you look at like the people who are young now, so people in elementary school, half the time, like if I see something on the internet or whatever, or if there's like a video of TikToks on YouTube, I'm like, I don't even know like what half of these words mean. Like it's not that I'm old, it's just there is definitely that cultural gap between people who are our age, people who are 14 right now, you know, people who are 45. So it's definitely a cultural gap. Typically in the US, old age is not really respected. As you get older, you like kind of, the perception in America is that, you know, you lose your faculties, you're not, you know, as intelligent anymore. But in other societies, you know, the older you are, the more revered it is. If you think of like Japan and Vietnam, there's specific endings or honorifics that you put on people's names based on like their status, which is very much tied to their age. So age is very important in those societies. And then typically in America, it's not. You don't gain status with age, you gain status with your accomplishments. That's not to say that either is better or worse than the other. It's just different. Any questions so far before we move on to race and ethnic identity? Okay, so racial and ethnic identity. So it's based to some degree on physical characteristics, but it's mainly socially constructed. You know, if you look at humans genetically, we're pretty much all the same. Some people have more melanin because their ancestors grew up in a place with more sun and they needed to be protected from skin cancer. And some people have less because they grew up in an area that had less sun and did not need to be as dark to protect themselves from skin cancer. And yet, we have had a whole bunch of issues just because of that. Yay. But in the US, racial identity is a pretty sensitive topic, especially if you think about just the things that have been going on within the past 5 years, and how people in minority races here in the US have been treated. I obviously am a European American, so it's not something that I struggle with, but it is an issue for a large number of Americans. Like, it is a huge issue for a lot of people. But how we construct racial identities and think about race influences how we communicate with others. Because if you have a perception that all people of this particular group are one way, then you're going to treat them in that way, when obviously, you know, that's a stereotype, could even be a prejudice that we need to make sure that, you know, we are not contributing to. Okay. And then our ethnic identity is our sense of belonging to a particular group and knowing something about that shared experience of the group. So the dimensions of ethnic identity would include self-identification. So you say, I belong to this particular group. You have knowledge about that particular culture, and you actually feel like you belong. So you say, I belong to this group, you know about it, and you actually feel like you have a place in that particular group. So it might involve a common sense of origin in history. So linking cultures. So you might be an American from Asia. You might be an American from Europe, or an American from Africa, or an American from Latin America. So some people might consider themselves hyphenated Americans, like Mexican American, European American, German American, Japanese American, Chinese American, or in terms of, regional. So like Apache American or Navajo American, or they might just consider themselves Navajo, Apache, Hopi, insert whatever here. Some people might even be Americans, but consider themselves more so of that origin outside the United States. They might say, no, yeah, I'm an American, but I am, Chinese, more so than that. And then racial versus ethnic identity. Some people say they're similar. Some people say they're different. But, if we look at specifically in the US, our views on this have very much been shaped by the American history of slavery. Whether that be slavery for, Black African Americans, whether that be when we enslaved the Native Americans, whether that be when we had indentured servitudes or indentured servants from like Ireland. Man, America's we had a lot of slaves and indentured servants, which is pretty much the same thing, just a nicer term for it. But it's just depending on how you identify and where you're from within the US, you probably have very different senses of racial and ethnic identity. And some people probably don't think about it very much. Like, if you're part of a majority group, you probably don't think about your racial and ethnic identity very much. But if you are part, in the US of a minority, it is something that you probably have to think about because, of the history of prejudice and discrimination in the United States. And we have our physical ability identity. So we all have different degrees of physical ability, and it can definitely change over a lifetime. Who knows when something may happen and you lose an arm or lose sight in one of your eyes or lose hearing or lose the ability to talk. But it could be temporary that you recover from. That you break a bone, you can't walk for a couple weeks because you broke a leg, and then you get it back. But 15% of the United States population has one or more physical disability, which is pretty significant when you think about it. And that was from 2005. So it's been 15 years since then. So, 15% of the population, that's a pretty decent chunk of a minority. But adjusting to disability involves changing the definitions of how people see themselves and how other people see them. And then, of course, it happens in stages. It's not all one smooth process like with any of this stuff. But, might be a focus on rehabilitation or what actually changed. And then you adjust to whatever happened and how you have changed, and it might affect your relationships. Some people, actually for a lot of people, the first thing we see might be a physical disability. If someone is missing a leg or is paraplegic, paralyzed, has a lot of facial scarring and can't see out of one of their eyes. And then finally, we have stigma incorporation. So where you're integrating that understanding of being disabled or differently abled into your definition of self and coming to realize, okay, this is going to be part of who I am. And people with disabilities tend to see themselves as a cultural group. If you think about, in particular, like the deaf community definitely has their own culture. Like they have their own language, they use sign language, they have their own systems of beliefs and values, they have their own ways of doing things. So, they are a community, and I'm probably sure it's same with other specific disabilities. But like I said, sometimes that might be the first thing we see in a person, and that can definitely cause communication to be more difficult, because people who are 100% able-bodied might feel a little bit awkward. So they might restrict their communication, they might avoid eye contact, just might not want to talk to them. So any questions so far? Okay, so moving on to religious identity. Religious identity tends to be a very important part of people's identities and their lives if they identify as religious. Obviously, if you don't identify as religious, it's probably not going to be important to you.
I need something to make it not weird. That's weird.
I'm sorry, what, Brendan?
Oh, sorry.
But religious conflicts have very much been a large part of history. A lot of our major conflicts have come from religious differences of people trying to impose what they believe on other people who may not believe the same thing, like the Crusades, and trying to reclaim the Holy Land and say, you guys all got to be Christian. But religious identity can be confused with racial and ethnic identities, especially if they are very entwined, like being Jewish. Being Jewish is passed down through a mother's maternal line. So if your mother is Jewish, then you are also technically Jewish. So that could be part of like that ethnic identity of like, my family is, but if you're not a practicing Jew, then are you religiously, or is that just like a racial identity, or what? So in intercultural communication, when you're trying to breach religious boundaries, can definitely be difficult, because it is something that people take very seriously, and people, are willing to fight and die for that belief. We've seen that for the past 4,000 years. In some cultures, the religion and the culture, even the government, can definitely be inseparable. Here in the US, we have separation of church and state. So that means at least our government and anyone's religious identity should be separate. But there is still a large percentage of the American population that does identify as religious, even though that percentage is decreasing as time goes on. So it's interesting to look at the criteria for being members of particular religions, because some of it you're born into. So like being Jewish is passed down through your mother's line. Some places you just walk into the church and then it's like, okay, I like this, and then you're part of the religion. Some places you have to be baptized into, like if you're a Baptist, you have to be baptized into the religion. So it's interesting to look at like the different criteria for that. You could start looking into Buddhism and just like, okay, well, I guess I'm a Buddhist now, versus actually having to go through maybe like paperwork or something. Class identity, and this is talking about like socioeconomic status, but it's not something that people often really think about, especially if you are middle class. If you are middle class or you are comfortable socioeconomically, then you probably don't really think about this. But if you tend to be lower socioeconomic status or struggle making enough money to pay rent, put food on the table, then your class identity is probably something you think about more. But it's really interesting to see how people communicate their socioeconomic status. Man, there's that meme. Hold on, I gotta show it to you guys. But it's relevant to this. Not sure where I saw it. Anyways, I'm sure I will probably find it on Instagram or something exactly when I'm like not looking for it and be like, oh gosh darn it, that's what I thought. I think it had like Mark Zuckerberg in it. Mark Zuckerberg? I did not spell his name right. Okay, well, anyways, like I said, I'm sure I will find it when it absolutely does not matter anymore. But, you know, we communicate our class identity through, you know, how we dress. What kind of clothes do you buy? What kind of food do you eat? How do you talk? I don't want to say obviously, but typically the higher educated you are, you know, the higher socioeconomic status, which means you probably speak better or at least speak more normative English. What kind of magazines do you read? What do you drink? Do you, what is that like thing of like, do you just drink tap water or do you buy like, what's a really expensive water bottle brand? Like the Fiji water? I'm sure there's one more expensive than that, but I ain't buying it. You know, and so on. So if we think about like stereotypical, like rich people food, who wants to pop in the chat with something that might be? Stereotypical, like quote unquote, rich people food.
Caviar.
Yeah, caviar, definitely. What else?
Really expensive wine or something like that.
Yeah, really expensive alcohols.
Shrimp and cocktail.
What was that?
Shrimp and cocktail.
Yeah, like shrimp cocktail, like nice seafood. So even like how people set the table can communicate something about class. Because I can tell you guys, if someone set like 3 different plates in front of me and then like 6 different utensils, I would not know what to do. Fancy table settings, that's what I'm looking for. Okay, yeah, so table setting for a fancy dinner. Oh, so if someone put that in front of me, or if someone put that in front of any of us, most of us would probably be like, what the heck? But if someone is super wealthy, they might get trained in this to know, okay, well, we use the salad fork first or the fish fork. Why are there different forks? That's not to say it's bad or anything, it's just different. And then if we think of like examples of typical like poor people food, hot dog soup, spaghetti and hot dogs. These are all things that like we definitely probably all eat right now. Ramen. Yeah, Ramon, ramen, definitely. But, you know, it influences how we think about other people and it shows in our actions. It's really actually, so like food is one thing that can be very different, but it's interesting to see how people dress. And that's why I was trying to find that meme, because there is like a picture of, like Mark Zuckerberg or someone just in basketball shorts and, probably just like a t-shirt from Walmart, and he's superbly wealthy. And then you have of like, people who might be lower socioeconomic status buying more brand name things to try to fit in. But the people who actually do have a lot of money might not always buy those things. But also that just depends on like personal preference and stuff too. So people assume that, however, if you work hard enough and persist enough, that you can move up in the social class hierarchy, which is not always the case, because a lot of it is luck and where you are born and who you are born to. You can definitely always better yourself and better your life, but most of us are probably not going to become millionaires, and most of us are probably not going to make, more than $100,000 a year. It would be nice if everyone was super successful, but it's just research shows otherwise, unfortunately. And as time goes on, the gap between the rich and the poor definitely grows, especially here in America. We have huge wealth inequality. So people are trying to, find solutions to that. We have people who make, billions of dollars. Why do we still have people who are sleeping on the streets? Typically, the poor and working class are blamed for their poverty rather than people looking at, the circumstances that have, led to that generational poverty and people being stuck in that cycle. But, that's one of those things that's not going to change overnight, that, we have to keep working on and saying, okay, how can we, lift people out of poverty? Because, most Americans are one or two paychecks away from being broke, even if they're middle class. So, how can we raise everybody up? Our national identity. So it's just your legal status in relation to a specific nation. So if you are someone who was born in the United States, or if you were born on a US military base or anything owned by the US, then congrats, you are legally an American and your national identity probably is American. People can definitely have dual citizenships. You could have a national identity that is different from your ethnic identity, but it can definitely be complicated. Because if your nation's status is unclear, right now, like the Ukraine, if someone, or in Crimea, which used to be part of Ukraine, which is Russia annexed it. If you are born in Crimea, are you Ukrainian? Are you Russian? If you are born in Palestine, who do you belong to? Like, what is your country? Because there's some countries that don't recognize Palestine as its own independent area. Some people say it belongs to Israel. Some people say it's its own. So are you Palestinian or are you Israeli? If there's civil wars going on, if someone's trying to take power, if your country splits. So even within the past, what is it? Actually, it's been like 30 years now. Oh my gosh. The former Yugoslavia splitting up, the Czech and Slovak republics splitting from Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. With Yugoslavia, with like Kosovo, so their countries all split and they had a civil war. So it can definitely be confusing. Nations can even fail and be absorbed into other ones. Nations can like come back. So luckily this is not a thing that happens too terribly much, but it definitely does, and it can, and it has. But you can definitely have more than one national identity. We have our regional identities. So identifying with a part of the world that is separate from your nation, that has its own distinct cultural identity. So regional identities in the US are pretty strong, like Texans, Southerners definitely have their own strong identity. Midwest, anyone in here from Chicago?
I am.
Okay, Imani, do you consider yourself a Midwesterner?
Yes.
Okay. See, I'm also from the Midwest, but I'm from like small town Midwest. So when I think of Chicago, like I don't think of Midwest, just because it's like, no, Chicago's a big town. Like Midwest is like small town. But people can identify very differently, because you might be like, no, I'm definitely a Midwesterner. Like I'm from Illinois. But I might be like, no, I'm from the Midwest. You're from, I don't even know then what Chicago would be if it wasn't Midwest. Chicago would be Northeast, I think. But, you know, some people can hold very strong regional identities. We have our stereotypical Texan, which most of us probably think it's like, okay, here's our stereotypical Texan. You know, some ranch guy who has a horse, has his cowboy hat, and that's what we think all Texans look like. Some Texans might even definitely be like, yeah, that describes me pretty well. But our regional identities, they're interesting. They can definitely be fun, but they can even lead to like independence movements. So like Scotland has had a call to become separate from the rest of like Britain, because they're just like, we have a strong national identity. We're tired of the rest of you Brits. There's been parts of Spain, it's up north. I'm trying to remember what the region's called. I think it's the Basque region of Spain, that has had calls for independence. Heck, even California and Texas have tried to put in movements to break away from the rest of the United States because they have such a strong regional identity. But it's definitely interesting to think about. And then of course we have our personal identity, which is our notion of self. So who we think we are, and then compared to like who others think we are. So each person, we all have our own personal identity, but it might not always be unified. There can definitely be warring identities or cognitive dissonance within us, which, you know, it's not comfortable, hence why we try to suppress cognitive dissonance. But it happens. But, you know, our personal identity is influenced by outside forces. And it's constrained by outside forces. So if you have family members who really pressure you to be one way, that might be constraining who you really want to be, or who you really think that you should be. But it can definitely come into conflict with other identities, and we're forced to choose between the two, or between the three, or however many identities it conflicts with. I'm trying to think of a good example of that, but all of mine are probably like extreme examples. Okay, so let's say that you identify very much as like a pacifist. So you don't want to hurt other people, you don't want to go to war, you know, you just kind of want to let people be and do your best to help them. But maybe you are also extremely patriotic and, you know, love the country that you live in. But if your country is under attack, you know, your identity as a patriot and wanting to protect it versus your identity as a pacifist might come into conflict when you think, okay, well, do I need to fight people? Do I need to hurt other people to protect my country? So, any questions so far about this? And what time are we at? 42. Probably, and we still got 12 slides. Oh my gosh. Okay, yeah, I guess we're not going to finish this one today either. Do any of you guys have any thoughts to wrap up before I stop the recording and take attendance?